Would you like to briefly explain how you started and how you've worked with other artists?
I'm a music lover. I have been from a very early age. The time I was a teenager, music was the most interesting thing in all of life, and it's been that way ever since.
You did a lot of poetry writing and as well as workshops for young talents, such as the Detroit Artists Society. Do you want to sort of explain what that was?
I've been writing poetry all my adult life. And my poetry grew out of my love for music. So I wrote poems and then I set them to music and I performed them with musical ensembles or just in duets with musicians. I was in Detroit in 1964 to attend graduate school at Wayne State University. I fell in with a group of young musicians, poets, filmmakers, artists, in the bohemian sector generally. And we formed a cooperative organization called the Detroit Artists Workshop. We presented music and poetry every Sunday. We had exhibits, we did workshops, poets did workshops with other poets, or filmmaking, you know, all that kind of stuff. And there wasn't anywhere for us to go at the time to get what we wanted, so we had to make it ourselves.
Management years when you
MC5. Yeah, I worked with a band in Detroit called the MC5. We lived in the same neighborhood. I just thought they were the greatest. And they didn't have any management. And eventually I thought, well, geez, I could do something for these guys that would be much better than what they have now. So I just got involved with these guys, and then we took on the music world, the music industry. I had quite an interesting time for a couple of years. From Detroit, your first influence is Motown.
Yeah.
That was the water in which the people swam. There were, you know, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Bo Diddley, and then the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Who, the Yardbirds, and then Jimi Hendrix and James Brown were very influential. And then they also liked blues. Hooker, Albert King, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, they played songs of theirs. Topper was, they were interested in jazz, avant-garde jazz. They were interested in John Coltrane, Sun Ra, people like that. They were really deeply influenced by James Brown. Style developed by James Brown to deliver his songs and to thrill the audience beyond measure. They wanted to be like that. The idea of making an incredible performance was foremost in their minds. How to present the music in a way that would lift the audience to another level. So it was really thrilling to work with these guys.
What were the influences in terms of music? How was the experience? How if you could just sort of go back in time maybe and just explain how it was in terms of the atmosphere and the crowd.
Then like the MC5 or like James Brown or Otis Redding or Jimi Hendrix or the Rolling Stones, you know. They would try to whip the audience into a frenzy. The music and the performance style, you know. And not the way, say, that the Beatles had audiences whipped into frenzy, but the audience were like 13-year-old girls, and it was all about the teen idol stuff, you know. But when James Brown, it was about those songs, you know, and what he was telling you, and the feeling. So he'd connect with the emotions of the audience. Like a black church experience. We get the people involved and lift their spirits, you know. In our case, we were playing to a lot of people on LSD. So that made it more intense to begin with. Also, the intensity of the pressure between who you were and what you were trying to be and the outside world, the squares, the police, the authorities.
You were imprisoned for in possession of marijuana. You had a lot of support, and there was the Free John Sinclair campaign. If you could just talk me through about the artists that were involved.
I was sentenced in Detroit, 9.5 to 10 years in prison for possessing 2 marijuana cigarettes. I was at the time a well-known poet, writer. I wrote for the weekly paper. As a manager of a band and producer of shows and free concerts and stuff like that, I knew all the bands and they all knew me, and we were all friends, and we got high together, because all bands smoke pot. When I was in prison, I communicated very closely with my brother, who was the chief of staff of our organization, and also my ex-wife, Lenny Sinclair, photographer, who was also at the core of the organization. The fact that these were my family members, I had complete communications with the outside and people that I was working with. Finally, my appeal had been heard, and we were waiting for it to be decided by the Michigan Supreme Court. And we thought it would be important to have a massive event to put pressure on the state legislature to vote this bill up or down. So we wanted to make them vote on this law, hoping, of course, that they would vote the right way. We organized this event, and we had an ally named Peter Andrews, a good friend of mine, and he was working as a consultant to the University of Michigan, Office of Major Events, to teach them how to do rock and roll concerts and make a lot of money, because that's what the future was going to be. He thought through his connections at the university he could get the big auditorium, the Chrysler basketball arena, almost 15,000 seats. So we started contacting everybody we knew. Jerry Rubin, who was a friend of ours, had become close with John Lennon and Yoko Ono in New York City. And he told them he was going to Ann Arbor to play this concert for Sinclair. And why didn't they come with him? And they said, well, maybe we will. And they did. Well, 3 days later, I was released from prison. And the law was changed by the legislature.
I'd just like to talk a bit about the Grandy and just your involvement in that, and the kind of music that was played, and the people, again, the type of people that came in and partied there.
The Grandy Ballroom was a building that had been built in the late 20s as a ballroom for ballroom dancing with big bands. Before the Beatles, you know, bands played songs by other people. Hits. They played the hits, you know, like they do today, I guess. The Grandy Ballroom started out in October 1966, and MC5, I was there when the MC5 kind of auditioned for Russ Gibb. He was looking for bands that he would like to present in Detroit. And it wasn't any way to go hear bands playing their own material, because nobody was. You know what I mean? They didn't, unless somebody made a 45 that was a hit locally, then they could play that. So he went and scouted out different bands, and that was the idea, that you would play your own material, original bands. Yeah. In an all-white environment with only the shopping mall as the social center of the community. Well, if you wanted to escape from this and go into this world that you were hearing about and reading about, and where these people were different, you came to the Grandy Ballroom. So it was the portal, so to speak, into a new world.
In your view, other than Rolling Stones and the Beatles, what other British artists and bands were played?
For a year, the first year, the Grande Ballroom featured bands from Detroit and Michigan. Brought the Grateful Dead on their first tour in '67 in August. And that went well, and so he started bringing bands into Detroit from the international circuit who weren't established pop acts. At the Grande, so he started bringing the second year, the Yardbirds played there, the Who, the Cream, Jeff Beck, John Mayall. I think it was too late for the Pretty Things, but they liked the Pretty Things in Detroit quite a bit. And like in England, the bands that made it first came out of the pop music tradition. The Beatles were a pop group from their inception, really. The Rolling Stones were a little, not quite as pop, but I mean, they were making hit records. And, well, and then they started out wearing uniforms and all that, and same haircut and all that kind of stuff. Well, the hippie music was coming from the whole other direction. It was people probably couldn't go into a studio and make a hit record because they probably weren't proficient enough or precise enough, you know, but they could get on stage and take some hell of a drugs and turn their amps way up, and they could play some stuff that would just turn the inside of your head out, you know. And then, so when they saw that people liked this, then they decided to let them make records. And every once in a while, somebody would make a record that also could be heard by the executives of a record company.